The blood-red sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Tropic, Utah, as Eleanor Ambrose clutched her sister's hands tightly, their knuckles white with fear. The wooden auction platform beneath their feet creaked ominously as Eleanor's throat closed with panic, eyes darting across the sea of hungry stares from men who viewed them as little more than cattle to be purchased, used, and discarded when convenient. It was June 1879, and the four Ambrose sisters stood trembling in the merciless heat. Eleanor, the eldest at 22, had promised their dying mother she would keep her sisters safe, but fate had cruelly intervened. After their father's gambling debts had mounted, his death left them destitute, their homestead seized, and now they faced the ultimate indignity, being sold to the highest bidder in a town where women were scarce and men desperate. "Next up, the Ambrose girls," bellowed the auctioneer, a portly man with a handlebar mustache and beady eyes. "4 fine specimens. Take your pick, gentlemen. Start the bidding at $20 apiece." Eleanor felt her 17-year-old sister Josephine trembling beside her. Then came Judith, 19, trying to look brave but failing miserably, and finally Julia, the youngest at 18, silently weeping. All four shared the same honey blonde hair and striking blue eyes, traits that made them valuable commodities in this harsh frontier land. "I'll give 30 for the eldest," called a voice from the crowd, belonging to a man with yellowed teeth and dirty fingernails. 40 for the youngest," shouted another, his eyes lingering on Julia's slender form in a way that made Eleanor's skin crawl. Bids continued, each more degrading than the last, as the sisters were evaluated like livestock. Eleanor closed her eyes, praying for a miracle she didn't believe would come. Then a deep voice cut through the clamor, silencing the crowd. $500, it declared firmly. "I'll take all 4 home." Eleanor's eyes snapped open to find the source of the voice. A tall man stood at the edge of the crowd, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the setting sun. A dusty black Stetson cast shadows across his face, but she could make out a strong jaw covered in stubble and eyes that blazed with determination. "Luke Jackson," someone in the crowd muttered. "The rancher from Willow Creek." The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up. "500 for all 4. "That's mighty generous, Mr. Jackson. Do we have any other bids?" the auctioneer called out after a moment of stunned silence. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. $500 was more than most men in Tropic made in 6 months, going once, going twice, sold to Mr. Jackson. Relief flooded Eleanor, quickly replaced by a new fear. What did this stranger want with 4 young women? But as the man approached the platform, she caught a glimpse of something unexpected in his eyes, not lust or greed, but something that almost resembled compassion. "Miss," he said, tipping his hat to Eleanor, "gather your sisters. My wagon's waiting." The sisters huddled together as they were escorted off the platform. Eleanor positioned herself between the stranger and her sisters, a human shield against whatever fate awaited them. "What are your intentions with us, Mr. Jackson?" she asked, trying to keep her voice from trembling. "To get you away from here," he replied simply. "The rest we can discuss once we're on the road." His wagon stood nearby, a sturdy vehicle hitched to 2 powerful horses. He helped each sister aboard with surprising gentleness before climbing up to take the reins. As they pulled away from Tropic, Eleanor watched the town recede into the distance. The sisters sat huddled together on the hard wooden bench, uncertain of their future, but clinging to one undeniable truth: whatever awaited them at Luke Jackson's ranch, it couldn't be worse than the auction block they'd just escaped. The wagon rattled over the uneven terrain, each jolt a reminder of how quickly their lives had changed. The sisters remained silent, their eyes occasionally meeting in wordless communication. Eleanor kept her gaze fixed on their mysterious benefactor, studying his profile for any hint of his true character. Luke Jackson drove with confidence, his hands steady on the reins. Occasionally, his eyes would flick to the mirrors beside him, ensuring they weren't being followed. The sun continued its descent, painting the vast Utah landscape in hues of gold and amber. "It's about 2 hours to my ranch," he finally said, breaking the tense silence. "You ladies must be hungry. There's some jerky and canteens in that sack behind you. Why did you buy us?" Julia blurted out, her voice small but defiant. Luke's expression remained impassive as he kept his eyes on the trail ahead. Nobody should be sold like that. Not cattle, not horses, and certainly not people. "So it was charity?" Josephine asked skeptically. "Call it what you want," he replied. "My ranch needs help and you four needed help. Seemed like a fair arrangement." "What kind of help?" Eleanor pressed, her protective instincts flaring. Luke glanced at her, and for a moment she caught a glimpse of something gentle behind his weathered exterior. "Cooking, cleaning, gardening. I've got 2,000 acres and a house that hasn't seen a woman's touch in years. Nothing improper, Miss Ambrose. You have my word." Eleanor wasn't sure why, but she found herself believing him. Perhaps it was the straightforward way he spoke, or perhaps it was simply that her alternatives were too grim to contemplate. "I'm Eleanor," she said finally. "These are my sisters Judith, Josephine, and Julia." He nodded. "Luke Jackson. I own the Double J Ranch about 15 miles outside of Willow Creek. It's not much to look at, but it's peaceful. Safe." As they continued their journey, the landscape changed from the red rock formations of tropic to rolling hills dotted with juniper and pine. The air grew cooler as they climbed in elevation, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Judith, always the practical one, finally spoke up. "Will we have our own quarters, Mr. Jackson?" "The main house has 5 bedrooms," he replied. "One's mine, the others will be yours. There's a smaller cabin nearby where my ranch hand stays. Jeb's been with me since I started. He's old enough to be your grandfather and harmless as they come." The tension in the wagon eased slightly at this information. Eleanor's mind raced with questions and possibilities. Was this truly salvation, or merely a different kind of trap? Yet something about Luke Jackson's straightforward manner suggested he was a man of his word. As darkness fell completely, Luke lit a lantern that hung from the wagon's frame, casting a small circle of light around them. The sisters huddled closer against the night chill, their thin dresses offering little protection against the mountain air. Without a word, Luke shrugged out of his coat and passed it back to them. "Share it," he said simply. "We're almost there." The coat smelled of leather, horses, and pine, not unpleasant. Eleanor thought as she wrapped it around Julia's shoulders. The gesture, small as it was, seemed to confirm her growing impression that Luke Jackson was not like the men they'd left behind in Tropic. After another hour of travel, lights appeared in the distance, gradually resolving into the windows of a substantial ranch house. As they drew closer, Eleanor could make out a 2-story structure with a wide front porch, surrounded by several outbuildings. A dog began to bark, announcing their arrival. "That's Boss," Luke explained as he guided the horses into the yard. "He sounds fierce, but he's never bitten anyone who didn't deserve it." The wagon came to a stop before the house, and for a moment, nobody moved. Then Luke jumped down and came around to help them descend. "Welcome to the Double J," he said, offering his hand first to Eleanor. Her fingers brushed his calloused palm as she stepped down from the wagon, feeling the solid ground beneath her feet. In the lantern light, she could finally see his face clearly weathered by sun and wind, with striking green eyes that held none of the malice she'd feared. A small scar cut through his right eyebrow, and laugh lines creased the corners of his eyes, suggesting he hadn't always been so serious. "It's late," he said, retrieving their small bundle of belongings from the wagon. "I'll show you to your rooms. We can talk more in the morning when you've had some rest." The interior of the ranch house surprised Eleanor. Though undeniably masculine in its furnishings, it was clean and well ordered. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, with comfortable-looking chairs arranged around it. Bookshelves lined one wall, evidence that Luke Jackson was not merely a man of physical labor. "Kitchen's through there," he said, pointing. "Bedrooms are upstairs. Mine's at the end of the hall. The others are yours to sort out among yourselves." As they climbed the stairs, Eleanor felt the weight of the day pressing down on her. Everything had happened so quickly: the auction, their purchase, and now this strange new beginning in an unfamiliar place. She glanced back to find Luke watching them from the foot of the stairs, his expression unreadable. "Get some sleep," he said. "Breakfast is at sunrise." With that, he turned and disappeared into another room, leaving the sisters to find their way. The bedrooms were simple but comfortable, each containing a bed with fresh linens, a small dresser, and a washstand. Windows looked out over the ranch, though in the darkness they could see little more than their own reflections. "What do you make of him?" Judith whispered once they'd gathered in the largest bedroom. "He seems decent enough," Josephine offered cautiously. "For now," Julia added, her young face still etched with worry. Eleanor sank onto the edge of the bed. "We don't have much choice but to trust him, at least until we figure something else out. We should be grateful we're together." "What do you think he really wants with us?" Judith pressed. "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "But whatever it is, we'll face it together, like we always have." They separated to their respective rooms, exhaustion finally overtaking fear. As Eleanor lay in her new bed, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, she couldn't help but wonder about the man sleeping at the end of the hall. Luke Jackson was an enigma, a man who'd spent a small fortune to rescue 4 strangers from a terrible fate, asking nothing in return but help with his ranch. Tomorrow, she promised herself as sleep began to claim her. Tomorrow she would begin to unravel the mystery of their benefactor. Morning arrived with golden light filtering through curtains Eleanor didn't recognize. For a moment, disorientation gripped her before the previous day's events came rushing back. The auction, the cowboy, their new home. She dressed quickly in one of her 2 dresses, splashed water on her face from the basin, and went to check on her sisters. All were awake, their expressions a mixture of trepidation and curiosity about what the day would bring. "Remember," Eleanor cautioned as they descended the stairs together, "we're grateful for his help, but we stay alert. We don't know him yet." The aroma of coffee and frying bacon guided them to the kitchen, where they found Luke at the cast-iron stove. He'd shed his formal attire from yesterday and wore a simple blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing muscular forearms marked with the occasional scar testament to years of hard ranch work. "Morning," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "Coffee's hot. Plates are in that cupboard if you want to set the table." The simple domesticity of the moment struck Eleanor as surreal. Yesterday they'd been merchandise on an auction block. Today they were setting a breakfast table as if nothing unusual had occurred. As they ate, Luke outlined the rhythms of ranch life: sunrise to sunset work, with cattle, horses, and crops all requiring constant attention. "The previous housekeeper left about a month ago," he explained between bites. "Got married and moved to Colorado. Place has been a bit neglected since." "Is that all you expect from us?" Eleanor asked directly. "Housekeeping," Luke met her gaze steadily. "I expect you to earn your keep, Miss Ambrose, but you're not prisoners here. Once you've worked off what I paid, you're free to stay or go as you please. How long would that take? Judith inquired. Luke considered. At fair wages for your work, about 8 months, less if you help with the ranch beyond the house. It wasn't ideal, but it was far better than the alternatives they'd faced in Tropic. 8 months of honest work in exchange for their freedom seemed a fair bargain. I'll need to go into town today, Luke continued. You can come along if you'd like. Might be good for you to get the lay of the land. The opportunity to see their new surroundings and perhaps assess escape routes if necessary was too valuable to pass up. Eleanor nodded. We'd appreciate that. After breakfast, they climbed into Luke's wagon once more, this time heading toward Willow Creek. The journey took less than an hour, revealing a town significantly larger than Tropic, with a proper main street lined with businesses, a general store, a bank, a hotel, and even a small schoolhouse. Willow Creek's growing, Luke explained as they approached. The railroad's planning to put a line through next year. It'll change everything. As they entered town, Eleanor noticed how people nodded respectfully to Luke. He was clearly well known and, judging by the greetings, well regarded. It was another small reassurance. Their first stop was the general store, a spacious establishment filled with everything from food staples to farm equipment. The proprietor, a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up as they entered. Luke Jackson, as I live and breathe, he exclaimed. And who might these lovely ladies be? Luke hesitated almost imperceptibly before answering. Thomas, meet the Ambrose sisters. They'll be helping out at the ranch. Eleanor sensed there was something Luke wasn't saying, but Thomas didn't seem to notice. Ladies, welcome to Willow Creek, he said warmly. Any friend of Luke's is a friend of mine. They spent nearly an hour in the store, with Luke purchasing supplies and encouraging the sisters to select fabric for new clothes. His generosity surprised Eleanor, who had expected frugality from a man who had already spent so much on their purchase. As they continued through town, Luke introduced them to various townspeople, always referring to them simply as his new help, but treating them with a respect that belied such a utilitarian description. They visited the small medical clinic, the post office, and finally stopped for lunch at a modest restaurant run by a cheerful woman named Mrs. Peterson. 4 new faces at once, she exclaimed as she served them plates heaped with food. Luke, you've been holding out on us. Where did you find these charming young women? Again, that slight hesitation before Luke answered. They needed work. I needed help. Seemed like Providence. Mrs. Peterson looked like she wanted to ask more questions, but something in Luke's expression discouraged it. Instead, she chatted amiably about local news while they ate. It was during their meal that Eleanor first noticed how some of the townspeople were looking at them with curiosity. Certainly, but also with something that might have been pity. She caught fragments of whispered conversations from nearby tables. Those poor girls. And decent of Luke to take them in. The realization hit her suddenly. They knew, or at least they suspected the truth about how the Ambrose sisters had come to be at the Double J Ranch. Heat rushed to Eleanor's cheeks, and she lowered her eyes to her plate. Across the table, Luke seemed to sense her discomfort. He finished his meal quickly and suggested they return to the ranch. The sisters agreed, suddenly eager to escape the scrutinizing gazes of the townspeople. As they drove back, Eleanor finally asked the question that had been forming in her mind. They know about the auction, don't they? Luke kept his eyes on the road. News travels fast in these parts. Why didn't you tell them the truth, that you bought us? The word tasted bitter on her tongue. His hands tightened on the reins. Because that's not how I see it. Then how do you see it, Mr. Jackson? He was silent for so long that Eleanor thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but firm. "I see it as 4 women who got dealt a bad hand and needed help. What happened in Tropic was wrong. I had the means to do something about it, so I did. You paid $500 for us," Judith pointed out from the back of the wagon. "That's not nothing, even for a successful rancher." Luke shrugged. "Money's just money." "What happened to your parents, if you don't mind my asking?" The abrupt change of subject caught Eleanor off guard, but she answered honestly. "Father died 6 months ago. Gambling debts. Mother passed 3 years before that from fever." "I'm sorry," he said, and sounded like he meant it. "Losing family's never easy." Something in his tone made Eleanor wonder if he spoke from experience, but before she could ask, they crested a hill and the Double J came into view below them, bathed in afternoon sunlight. "Home, sweet home," Luke said, urging the horses forward. "Home." The word echoed strangely in Eleanor's mind. Could this place, this ranch belonging to a man they barely knew, ever truly be home? As the days passed, life at the Double J settled into a rhythm. The sisters divided the household tasks according to their strengths. Eleanor took charge of the cooking, having learned at their mother's side. Judith, with her eye for detail, managed the cleaning and organization. Josephine, who had always loved working with her hands, tended the vegetable garden that had fallen into neglect. And Julia, the most creative among them, worked on making the house more homelike with small decorative touches. Luke rose before dawn each day and returned late, the demands of the ranch keeping him constantly occupied. They saw him mainly at mealtimes, where conversation gradually became less strained. He never intruded on their privacy, maintaining a respectful distance that Eleanor found both reassuring and, increasingly, somewhat disappointing. She found herself curious about the solitary rancher who had changed their fate so dramatically. About a week after their arrival, Eleanor rose earlier than usual, unable to sleep in the pre-dawn quiet. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, she slipped downstairs, thinking to start breakfast before her sisters awoke. To her surprise, she found the kitchen already occupied. Luke stood at the table, his back to her, studying what appeared to be papers spread across its surface. He wore only his trousers and an undershirt, his usual formal demeanor softened by the early hour and lack of proper attire. Without his hat, she could see that his dark hair was longer than she'd realized, curling slightly at the nape of his neck. She must have made some small noise, for he turned suddenly, surprise flickering across his features. "Miss Ambrose," he said, hastily gathering the papers. "You're up early." "Eleanor," she corrected gently. "After all we've been through, I think you can use my given name." A small smile touched his lips. "Eleanor, then. Couldn't sleep." "The house makes different noises than I'm used to," she admitted, moving to the stove. "I thought I'd start breakfast." "Don't trouble yourself on my account," he said. "I was about to ride out to check the north pasture." Eleanor noticed dark circles beneath his eyes. "Do you ever rest, Mr. Jackson?" "Luke," he countered, echoing her earlier correction. "And not often enough, according to Jeb." She smiled at that. They'd met the ranch hand Jeb Taylor a few days after arriving, a weathered old cowboy with a white beard and twinkling eyes, who treated Luke with the familiar exasperation of a father for a hardworking but stubborn son. "Well, Luke," she said, testing the familiarity of his name, "you can't run a ranch on an empty stomach. Sit down while I fix something." To her surprise, he complied, watching as she stoked the stove and began preparing a simple breakfast of eggs and biscuits. As she worked, she became increasingly aware of his gaze, not intrusive or inappropriate but attentive in a way that made her cheeks warm. "You cook like you've been doing it all your life," he observed. "Since I was 12, she confirmed. "After Mother died, someone had to feed the family. Father wasn't much good at domestic matters. You've been taking care of your sisters a long time." It wasn't a question, but Eleanor nodded anyway. "They're all I have left." Luke was quiet for a moment. "Family's precious. You're lucky to have each other." "Do you have family, Luke?" she asked, setting a plate before him. A shadow crossed his face. "Not anymore. Parents died when I was young. No siblings." "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it. "It must be lonely sometimes." He met her eyes, and for a moment Eleanor glimpsed something vulnerable behind his stoic exterior. "It is," he admitted quietly. "But I've made my peace with it." They ate in companionable silence as dawn painted the sky outside the kitchen window. When Luke finished, he thanked her with more warmth than she'd heard in his voice before, then disappeared to prepare for his day's work. Later, as her sisters joined her in the kitchen, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the brief exchange. For the first time since arriving at the Double J, she'd seen Luke Jackson as more than just their mysterious benefactor. She'd seen him as a man, solitary and perhaps lonelier than he cared to admit. The revelation lingered in her mind throughout the day as she went about her tasks. Whenever she caught a glimpse of him through the windows, working with the horses or mending fences, she found herself studying him with new interest. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Josephine brought up a subject they hadn't yet discussed. "Mr. Jackson, Luke," she corrected herself, "we've been wondering about church services. Is there a congregation in Willow Creek?" Luke nodded. "Baptist church in town. Service is at 10 on Sundays. I can take you in the wagon if you'd like to attend." "You don't go yourself?" Julia asked. A brief smile touched his lips. "Not regularly. God and I have an understanding I don't bother him on Sundays, and he doesn't ask why I'm not in church." Judith, always the most outspoken about matters of faith, looked scandalized. "But your immortal soul is between me and my Maker," Luke finished gently. "But don't let my habits influence yours. I'll have the wagon ready at 9 on Sunday if you ladies want to attend." True to his word, when Sunday arrived, Luke had the wagon prepared and waiting in the yard. To the sisters' surprise, he was dressed more formally than usual, in a clean white shirt with a string tie and his best trousers. "You're coming?" Eleanor asked as they climbed aboard. "Thought I might," he replied casually. "Been a while since I heard a good sermon." The church in Willow Creek was a simple white painted building with a modest steeple. As they arrived, Eleanor noticed how people turned to stare, not just at the four unfamiliar young women, but at Luke himself, as if his presence was the greater novelty. "Luke Jackson in church," murmured an elderly woman as they passed. "Wonders never cease." Inside, the church was nearly full, forcing them to take a pew near the front. Luke sat at the end with Eleanor beside him and her sisters following in a row. Throughout the service, Eleanor was acutely aware of his presence, the way he followed along in the hymnal, though he didn't sing, how he listened intently to the sermon about the Good Samaritan, the way his hand occasionally brushed against hers when they both reached for the hymnal. After the service, the congregation gathered outside for socializing. Luke stayed close to the sisters, introducing them to people they hadn't met during their previous visit to town. Most were welcoming, though Eleanor noticed a few curious glances and whispers. "Luke Jackson," called a female voice, and they turned to see an elegantly dressed woman approaching. With her auburn hair arranged in a fashionable style and her dress clearly expensive, she stood out among the more practically attired townspeople. "What a delightful surprise to see you here." "Mrs. Thornton," Luke acknowledged with a nod. "I trust you're well, very well indeed," she replied, her eyes sweeping over the Ambrose sisters with barely concealed curiosity. "And these must be the young ladies everyone's talking about." Luke's expression remained neutral as he made introductions. The Ambrose sisters, Eleanor, Judith, Josephine, and Julia, Ladies, this is Victoria Thornton. Her late husband owned the bank in town. Mrs. Thornton extended a gloved hand to Eleanor. Charmed, I'm sure. How are you finding life at the Double J? Luke's ranch can be so rustic. The slight emphasis she placed on the last word made it clear she considered rustic a polite substitute for something less complimentary. We find it quite comfortable, Eleanor replied evenly. Mr. Jackson has been very accommodating. Has he indeed? Mrs. Thornton's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly. How? Interesting. Luke has always been something of a lone wolf. We've tried for years to civilize him, haven't we, Luke? And failed spectacularly, he responded dryly. If you'll excuse us, Mrs. Thornton, we should be getting back to the ranch. As they walked away, Eleanor could feel the woman's gaze following them. She doesn't seem to like us very much, she observed quietly. Luke glanced down at her. Victoria doesn't like anyone she considers beneath her, which is most of Willow Creek. Don't take it personally. She seems to know you well, Josephine remarked. A muscle tightened in Luke's jaw. Her husband and I had business dealings, nothing more. The short exchange left Eleanor with the distinct impression there was a history between Luke and Mrs. Thornton that he wasn't sharing. The thought bothered her more than it should have. On the drive back to the ranch, Luke was unusually quiet, his brow furrowed in thought. Eleanor found herself watching his profile, noting the way the sunlight caught in his dark hair and emphasized the strong line of his jaw. When had she started noticing such things about him? As they approached the Double J, Luke finally broke his silence. I should warn you, the Thorntons have considerable influence in these parts. Victoria likes to know everyone's business, especially mine. She'll probably be asking questions about you in town. Why would she care about us? Julia asked. Luke's hands tightened on the reins. Because you're living under my roof, and that makes you interesting to her. Just be careful what you say if you run into her again. The warning stirred Eleanor's curiosity, but Luke changed the subject, asking about their impressions of the church service. By the time they reached the ranch, the moment for further questions had passed. That night, as Eleanor prepared for bed, she found herself reflecting on their day in town. Luke's unexpected appearance at church, Mrs. Thornton's barely concealed hostility, and the continuing curious glances from the townspeople all suggested there was more to Luke Jackson than the solitary rancher he presented himself to be. She was still pondering these mysteries when a sound from outside caught her attention. Moving to the window, she peered out into the moonlit yard to see Luke walking toward the small pond that lay about 100 yards from the house. His posture suggested a man deep in troubled thought. Without giving herself time to reconsider, Eleanor threw a shawl around her shoulders and quietly made her way downstairs and out of the house. The night air was cool against her skin as she followed the path Luke had taken. She found him sitting on a large rock beside the pond, staring out over the water. For a moment she hesitated, wondering if she was intruding on a private moment, but something in his solitary figure tugged at her heart and she stepped forward. Couldn't sleep? She asked softly. Luke turned, surprise evident on his face. Eleanor, what are you doing out here? I saw you from my window, she admitted. You looked troubled. He looked away, back toward the pond where moonlight danced on the gently rippling surface. Just thinking. Eleanor moved closer, taking a seat on the edge of the rock. About Mrs. Thornton, a rueful smile touched his lips. Among other things. You don't have to tell me, she said quickly. It's none of my business. No, he agreed, but I suppose you've earned some answers. You and your sisters have been living under my roof for weeks now, working hard, asking few questions. She waited, letting him gather his thoughts. Victoria Thornton's husband, Richard, was one of the wealthiest men in the territory, Luke finally said. He owned the bank, had investments in mining, controlled half the water rights for 50 miles. He was also corrupt to the bone. Eleanor listened intently as Luke continued. 3 years ago, he tried to force me to sell the Double J. When I refused, he called in loans I didn't even know were due, threatened to dam the creek that runs through my property. I fought back legally through the courts. It got ugly. What happened? Eleanor prompted when he fell silent. Richard died before it was resolved. Heart failure, they said. Victoria inherited everything, including his grudge against me. She's never forgiven me for standing up to him. That hardly seems fair, Eleanor observed. Luke shrugged. Life rarely is, as you know better than most. The reference to their own difficult circumstances reminded Eleanor of something that had been nagging at her. Luke, why did you really buy us at that auction? The truth, please. He met her gaze directly, his eyes reflective in the moonlight. Because 4 years ago I saw another auction like that, a widow and her daughter. I didn't have the money to help them then. I've regretted it ever since. The simple honesty of his answer touched Eleanor deeply. So it was redemption. Call it what you will, he said, echoing his words from their first morning at the ranch. I couldn't stand by and watch it happen again, not when I could do something about it. They sat in silence for a few moments, the night sounds of the ranch surrounding them. Crickets chirped, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. Thank you, Eleanor said finally. Not just for telling me, but for what you did for us. I don't think I've said that properly yet. Luke looked at her, his expression softening. You've thanked me every day with your hard work and care for this place. All of you have. Still, she insisted, it was a remarkable thing to do for strangers. You're not strangers anymore, he said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning that Eleanor wasn't sure she was ready to acknowledge. She was suddenly very aware of how close they were sitting, of the way the moonlight cast shadows across his features, highlighting the strength and surprising gentleness there. I should go back inside, she said, breaking the moment. It's late. Luke nodded, rising to his feet and offering her his hand. I'll walk you back. Her fingers curled around his, warm and strong as he helped her up. To her surprise, he didn't release her hand immediately, and they walked back toward the house together, connected by that simple touch. At the porch, Luke finally let go, stepping back with a respectful nod. Good night, Eleanor. Good night, Luke, she replied, her hand still tingling from his touch as she slipped inside. As she climbed the stairs to her room, Eleanor realized that something had shifted between them tonight. Luke was no longer just their benefactor or employer, he was becoming something else, something both exhilarating and frightening in its possibilities. The following weeks brought subtle changes to life at the Double J. Luke began joining them more regularly for meals, lingering at the table for conversation rather than rushing back to his work. He started teaching Josephine about the vegetable garden, showing her techniques for desert farming that she eagerly adopted. When Judith expressed interest in the ranch's account books, he spent an evening patiently explaining his record-keeping system. And Eleanor found herself seeking out his company in small ways, bringing him coffee when he worked in the barn, asking his advice about preserving food for the coming winter, sitting beside him in the evenings when he occasionally read aloud from one of his books. Her sisters noticed, of course. One afternoon, as they worked together hanging laundry, Judith broached the subject. You and Luke have been spending a lot of time together, she observed, trying to sound casual and failing miserably. Eleanor focused on smoothing a wrinkle from one of Luke's shirts. He's teaching me about ranch life. Is that what they're calling it these days? Josephine teased, earning herself a flick with a wet dishcloth. Don't be ridiculous, Eleanor protested, though she could feel heat rising to her cheeks. He's our employer. "He's a good man," Julia said quietly. "And he looks at you when you're not watching." Eleanor's hand stilled on the laundry. "What do you mean?" Julia shrugged. "Just what I said. When you're cooking or reading or doing anything really, his eyes follow you. It's sweet." "You're imagining things," Eleanor insisted, though her heart had begun to beat a little faster. "We're not blind, Ellie," Judith said gently. "And we wouldn't mind, if there was something between you two." Eleanor hung the last piece of laundry with more force than necessary. "There's nothing between us except mutual respect and perhaps friendship, and that's all there should be." Her sisters exchanged knowing glances but dropped the subject, leaving Eleanor to her confused thoughts. Were they right? Did Luke look at her when she wasn't aware? And more troublingly, why did the thought please her so much? That evening, a thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains, bringing much-needed rain but also fierce winds that rattled the windows of the ranch house. After dinner, as lightning flashed across the sky, the sisters gathered in the main room where Luke had built a fire to ward off the sudden chill. "Perfect night for a story," he remarked, settling into his chair by the fireplace. "You know many?" Julia asked eagerly. At 18, she still retained a childlike enthusiasm for tales and adventures. Luke smiled, the firelight softening his features. "A few. My mother was a great storyteller. She used to say that stories keep people connected to their past and to each other. Will you share one?" Josephine prompted. He looked thoughtful for a moment, then nodded. "There's one about a man who traveled far across the prairie, searching for a place to call home." As Luke's deep voice filled the room, weaving a tale of hardship, perseverance, and eventual triumph, Eleanor found herself captivated not just by the story, but by the storyteller. His face came alive as he spoke, his hands occasionally gesturing to emphasize a point, his eyes reflecting both the firelight and the emotion of the narrative. When he finished, there was a moment of appreciative silence before the sisters began asking questions about the tale and whether it was based on true events. Luke answered thoughtfully, revealing more about his knowledge of frontier history than he had previously shared. As the conversation continued, Eleanor excused herself to make coffee. In the kitchen, she moved about her familiar tasks, her mind still dwelling on the image of Luke beside the fire, his voice drawing them all into the world of his story. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't hear him enter the kitchen until he spoke. "Need any help?" She turned to find him leaning against the doorframe, watching her with an expression that made her pulse quicken. "Just preparing coffee," she said, striving for normalcy despite the sudden flutter in her stomach. "Your story was wonderful. You have a gift for it." He shrugged, moving further into the kitchen. "My mother's influence. She believed stories were as essential as food and shelter." "She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was," he agreed, a fond sadness coloring his tone. "She would have liked you, Eleanor." The simple statement touched her deeply. "Tell me about her." Luke leaned against the counter, close enough that Eleanor could smell the wood smoke that clung to his clothes from the fire. "She came west as a bride, following my father's dream of building a cattle empire. Times were hard: drought, Indian raids, outlaws. But she never complained, never suggested going back east. She taught school whenever we stayed in one place long enough, insisted I learn to read and cipher even when we were traveling." "What happened to her?" Eleanor asked softly. "Cholera. I was 15. Father never really recovered from losing her. He died 2 years later, some said, from a broken heart, though the doctor called it pneumonia." "So you've been on your own since you were 17, Eleanor observed, understanding better now the self-reliance that defined him. Luke nodded. "Built this place from nothing, just me and Jeb for the first few years." "It's impressive what you've accomplished," she said sincerely. His eyes met hers, warm with something that might have been appreciation or perhaps something deeper. "What about you, Eleanor? What dreams did you have before life took its unexpected turns?" The question caught her off guard. For so long, her only goal had been survival and keeping her sisters safe. Dreams had seemed like luxuries they couldn't afford. "I wanted to teach," she admitted finally. "Like your mother, I suppose. I've always loved books, learning." "You'd make a fine teacher," he said. "Willow Creek School could use someone like you." "Perhaps someday," she replied, though the idea seemed distant and unreachable. Luke stepped closer, his voice dropping slightly. "Why not sooner? You've more than worked off what I paid in Tropic. You and your sisters are free to pursue whatever lives you choose." Eleanor's hand stilled on the coffee cups. "Are you asking us to leave?" "No," he said quickly, his hand coming to rest lightly on her arm. "God, no. I'm saying you have choices now. All of you do." The touch of his hand, warm through the fabric of her sleeve, distracted Eleanor from the implications of his words. They stood close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, could trace the path of the scar through his eyebrow, could notice the slight stubble darkening his jaw at the end of a long day. "And if we choose to stay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His gaze intensified, dropping briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes. "Then I'd be very glad of it." The moment stretched between them, electric with possibility. Eleanor felt herself leaning slightly toward him, drawn by a force she couldn't name. Luke's hand slid from her arm to her waist, gentle but sure. A sudden crash of thunder broke the spell, making them both jump. From the other room came Judith's startled exclamation, followed by laughter from the other sisters. Luke stepped back, his hand falling away from her waist. "I should check that the barn is secure in this storm." "Of course," Eleanor said, trying to steady her breathing. "Be careful." He nodded, hesitating as if there was more he wanted to say, then turned and left the kitchen. Eleanor remained still, her heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just transpired or almost transpired between them. When she finally returned to the main room with the coffee, her sisters looked at her curiously. "You were gone a while," Judith observed. "Everything all right?" "Fine," Eleanor replied too quickly. "Luke went to check on the barn." Josephine raised an eyebrow. "In this weather, must be important." Eleanor avoided her sister's knowing gaze, focusing instead on distributing the coffee cups. But her mind remained in the kitchen, replaying those moments with Luke, the warmth of his hand at her waist, the intensity in his eyes, the way her heart had leaped when he looked at her lips. Something was happening between them, something both thrilling and terrifying in its implications. For all her practical nature, Eleanor found herself unable to deny the truth any longer. She was developing feelings for Luke Jackson that went far beyond gratitude or friendship. The question now was what to do about it, and whether Luke truly shared those feelings, or if she was misinterpreting his kindness for something more. The morning after the storm dawned clear and bright, the countryside washed clean by the rain. Eleanor rose early, her sleep having been fitful and filled with thoughts of Luke. She moved quietly through the house, not wanting to wake her sisters, and made her way to the kitchen to begin breakfast. To her surprise, she found a note on the kitchen table in Luke's distinctive handwriting. "Gone to check fence lines damaged in storm. Back by evening." She tried to ignore the disappointment that washed over her. After their moment in the kitchen last night, she had hoped to see him this morning, to gauge whether anything had changed between them. As she prepared breakfast, she rehearsed conversations in her mind, imagining what she might say to him upon his return. But every scenario felt awkward or presumptuous. What if she had misinterpreted everything? What if his almost gesture had been nothing more than a momentary impulse he now regretted? Her sisters joined her one by one, and life at the ranch continued with its usual tasks. Eleanor threw herself into her work, cleaning the house more thoroughly than necessary, preparing an elaborate dinner as if the activity could distract her from her circling thoughts. Late in the afternoon, as she was kneading dough for bread, she heard the sound of horses in the yard. Looking out the window, she saw not just Luke returning, but a wagon following behind him containing several men she didn't recognize. Wiping flour from her hands, she moved to the front door, her sisters joining her on the porch as the men dismounted. "Ladies," Luke greeted them, removing his hat. "We have guests." Part of the northeast fence line was completely destroyed in the storm. These gentlemen have offered to help repair it. He introduced the men, neighboring ranchers, and their hands who had come to assist with the repairs. Such cooperation was common in the territory, where the harsh conditions made mutual aid essential for survival. "We'll need to feed about 10 extra for dinner," Luke said apologetically to Eleanor. "I'll manage," she assured him, already calculating how to stretch the meal she'd planned. For the next several hours, the ranch hummed with activity. The men worked on cutting and preparing new fence posts, while Eleanor and her sisters scrambled to prepare a meal large enough to feed the unexpected crowd. By sunset, the workers had returned from the fields, and the expanded dining table was laden with beef stew stretched with extra vegetables, fresh bread, and apple pies made from the last of the previous year's preserved fruit. Luke took his place at the head of the table, with Eleanor to his right, as had become their custom. The meal was lively, filled with conversation and laughter as the men shared stories of previous storms and cooperative work efforts. Throughout the dinner, Eleanor was acutely aware of Luke beside her, the occasional brush of his arm against hers as he reached for the bread, the way he made sure her glass was never empty, the proud glance he gave her when one of the ranchers complimented the food. "You've got yourself quite a cook here, Jackson," remarked one of the older men, wiping his mouth with satisfaction. "Been a long time since I've had a meal this good." "Miss Ambrose is talented in many ways," Luke replied, his eyes meeting Eleanor's briefly. "All the sisters have brought considerable improvements to the Double J." "Sisters, eh?" Another rancher looked around the table with new interest. "You keeping them all to yourself, or might some of us have a chance?" The question, though delivered jokingly, carried an uncomfortable undertone that made Eleanor tense. Beside her, she felt Luke stiffen. "The Ambrose sisters are under my protection," he said, his voice deceptively casual but with steel beneath. "They're not available for courting." An awkward silence fell over the table, broken only when Judith smoothly changed the subject, asking one of the men about his cattle breeding program. The conversation resumed, but Eleanor's mind remained stuck on Luke's words, "under his protection." Not available for courting. What exactly did he mean by that? After dinner, the men retired to the porch to smoke and continue their conversations. The sisters cleared the table and began washing the dishes, working with the efficient rhythm they had developed over the weeks. "Under his protection," Josephine mimicked Luke's deep voice once they were alone in the kitchen. "Did you hear that, Ellie? He's practically staked his claim on all of us." "He was just being protective," Eleanor defended, though the words had stirred both confusion and a secret pleasure in her. "You know how men can be when they've had a good meal and are feeling jovial." "It was more than that," Julia insisted. "You should have seen his face when that man asked if we were available. He looked ready to throw him out the door." Judith, ever the practical one, added her observation. "Luke's a respected man in these parts. His protection means something. He was establishing boundaries for those men." Eleanor focused on scrubbing a particularly stubborn pot, avoiding her sister's speculative gazes. It doesn't necessarily mean anything personal, doesn't it? Josephine pressed. Because I've seen the way he looks at you, Ellie, and it's not the way he looks at us. Before Eleanor could formulate a response, the kitchen door opened and Luke himself entered, carrying a stack of remaining plates from the dining room. "Thought you ladies could use an extra hand," he said, setting the dishes beside the wash basin. "Thank you," Eleanor replied, painfully aware of her sister's knowing glances. "The men enjoying their evening? Well enough. They'll be leaving soon. They all have their own ranches to get back to." He hesitated, then added, "I hope you weren't uncomfortable with Hanson's comment at dinner. He meant no disrespect." "We've heard worse," Judith assured him. Luke frowned slightly. "That doesn't make it acceptable, not in my house, his house." Eleanor was reminded again that for all the comfort they had found at the Double J, they remained guests, employees, really in Luke Jackson's home. As if reading her thoughts, he continued, "Which reminds me, there's something I've been meaning to discuss with all of you." The sisters exchanged glances, a sudden tension filling the kitchen. Was this the moment he would tell them their time at the ranch was coming to an end? "As I mentioned to Eleanor last night, you've more than worked off the money I paid in Tropic," Luke said, confirming Eleanor's fear. "You're free to make your own choices now." Josephine's hands stilled in the dishwater. "Are you asking us to leave?" "Not at all," Luke assured them quickly. "In fact, I'm hoping you'll stay, permanently, if that's what you want." Relief washed over Eleanor, followed immediately by confusion. "As your employees," Luke's gaze shifted to her, his expression difficult to read in the lamplight. "As whatever you want to be. The Double J is prospering like never before with your help. There's room here for all of you to build lives of your own." "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Jackson?" Judith asked, ever direct. He took a deep breath. "I'm proposing that you consider the Double J your home, not just a temporary place of employment. I can help you establish yourselves, Josephine. You've shown real talent with the garden. We could expand it, perhaps sell produce in town. Judith, your head for figures could be put to use in a more formal capacity, managing the ranch's books. Julia, your artistic abilities could find expression in any number of ways. And Eleanor," Julia prompted when he didn't continue. Luke's eyes remained fixed on Eleanor, something vulnerable showing through his usually composed expression. "Eleanor has dreams of her own that I hope she might pursue, with the ranch as her home base." The offer was generous, more than they could have hoped for when they stood trembling on that auction block in Tropic. Yet Eleanor sensed there was something more behind Luke's words, something he wasn't quite saying. "That's very kind," she said carefully, "but I'm not sure I understand. Would we be partners in the ranch, tenants? What exactly would our position be?" Luke ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of uncertainty. "That would depend on what you want. I'm offering you choices, Eleanor, all of you. Real choices, not just the illusion of them." "We need time to think about it," Judith said practically. "This is a significant decision." "Of course," Luke agreed. "Take all the time you need." His eyes lingered on Eleanor for a moment longer before he nodded and left the kitchen, returning to his guests on the porch. As soon as he was gone, Josephine turned to Eleanor. "Well, that was interesting." "What do you think he really meant?" Julia wondered. It seemed like he was trying to say something more. Eleanor stared at the door through which Luke had departed, her thoughts in turmoil. "I don't know, but I intend to find out." After the visiting ranchers had departed and the house had quieted for the night, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep. Luke's offer kept replaying in her mind, along with all the small moments they had shared over the past week's conversations by the fire, walks around the ranch, the almost kiss in the kitchen during the storm. Finally giving up on sleep, she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and descended to the main floor. A light still burned in Luke's study, spilling from beneath the closed door. Taking a deep breath, she knocked softly. "Come in," his voice called. She pushed open the door to find him seated at his desk, papers spread before him, a glass of whiskey at his elbow. He looked up in surprise when he saw her. "Eleanor, is everything all right?" "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, remaining in the doorway. "I keep thinking about your offer." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Would you like to discuss it further?" She entered, closing the door quietly behind her, and took the offered seat. For a moment, neither spoke, the only sound in the room the ticking of the clock on the mantel. "I meant what I said," Luke finally broke the silence. "You and your sisters are welcome to stay at the Double J to build lives here if that's what you want." "But what do you want, Luke?" Eleanor asked directly. "You've done so much for us already. Bought us from that auction, given us shelter, work, respect. Now you're offering us a future here. Why?" He looked down at his hands, then back up at her, his expression open in a way she had rarely seen. "Because the Double J hasn't felt like a home since my parents died. Not until you four arrived." The admission, simple and honest, touched something deep within Eleanor. "Is that the only reason?" Luke held her gaze, something shifting in his eyes. "No," he said quietly, "it's not the only reason." He stood, moving around the desk to lean against it directly in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head up to maintain eye contact. "I care about all of you," he continued. "You've brought life and warmth back to this place. But Eleanor—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "With you, it's different." Her heart began to race. "Different how?" Instead of answering immediately, he reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. The contact sent warmth spreading through her. "I never expected this," he said softly. "When I rode into Tropic that day, all I wanted was to right a wrong, to help 4 young women who deserved better than what fate had dealt them. I didn't expect to find someone who would make me question my solitary existence, who would make me want more than just running this ranch day after day." Eleanor leaned slightly into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "What do you want, Luke?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You," he answered simply. "If you'll have me." The directness of his answer took her breath away. For a moment, she couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the realization that her feelings were not one-sided, that this man who had saved her and her sisters from a terrible fate now wanted something she had scarcely allowed herself to hope for. "My sisters," she began, but he cut her off gently. "We'll always have a home here, regardless of your answer. This isn't conditional, Eleanor. I'm not offering you a bargain or a transaction. I'm offering you my heart, freely given." Tears pricked at her eyes. After everything they had endured, the loss of their parents, the humiliation of the auction, the uncertainty of their future, to hear such words from a man like Luke Jackson seemed almost too much to comprehend. "I've been alone a long time," he continued when she remained silent. "I thought that was my path, that solitude was my lot in life. Then you stood on that auction block, proud and defiant despite your circumstances, and something changed for me. I didn't understand it then, but I do now." He took her hands in his, drawing her gently to her feet so they stood face to face. "I love you, Eleanor Ambrose. I love your strength, your kindness, your devotion to your sisters. I love the way you've made this house into a home again. I love the person I am when I'm with you." The tears she had been holding back spilled over, tracking silently down her cheeks. Luke brushed them away with his thumb, his touch infinitely tender. "You don't have to answer now," he said. "Take all the time you need. Think about what you want, what would make you happy." Eleanor shook her head, a smile breaking through her tears. "I don't need time. I've known for weeks, I just didn't dare hope you felt the same." "And what have you known?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "That I love you too," she whispered. "That you've given me more than shelter and safety, you've given me a future I never thought I'd have. A chance to dream again." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after the longest night. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned down until his lips met hers in a kiss that was gentle at first, then deepening as she responded, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Luke rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the night of the storm," he confessed. "Why didn't you?" she asked. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid you might feel obligated because of what I did in Tropic. Afraid you might not truly have a choice if I revealed my feelings too soon." His consideration for her autonomy, his determination that she should make her own choices freely, only confirmed what she already knew, that Luke Jackson was a man unlike any other, a man worthy of her heart. "I choose you," she said simply. "Not out of obligation or gratitude, but because of who you are and how you make me feel." He kissed her again, his arms encircling her waist, drawing her closer. Eleanor melted into the embrace, all her doubts and fears fading in the warmth of his affection. When they separated, Luke looked down at her with wonder in his eyes. "We should tell your sisters," he said. "I want to do this properly." Eleanor couldn't help but laugh at his sudden formality. "They already know, or at least they suspect. They've been teasing me about it for weeks." "Still," he insisted, "I want them to know my intentions are honorable. I want to court you openly, Eleanor, not in secret." "Court me," she repeated, amused by the old-fashioned term. "We live under the same roof, Luke. I think we're well past the traditional courtship stage." He grinned, some of his usual confidence returning. "Maybe so, but I want to do right by you. No one in Willow Creek is going to whisper about Eleanor Ambrose being anything less than properly respected by Luke Jackson." The mention of the town reminded Eleanor of something. "What about Mrs. Thornton? She seemed rather possessive of you." Luke's expression hardened slightly. "Victoria Thornton has no claim on me, nor has she ever. She liked the idea of being married to the owner of the Double J after her husband died, but I never encouraged her interest." "She won't be pleased," Eleanor observed. "I don't particularly care," Luke replied bluntly. "My only concern is you and your sisters." The simple declaration warmed Eleanor's heart. She reached up to touch his face, tracing the scar through his eyebrow with gentle fingers. "I never imagined, standing on that auction block in Tropic, that life could turn out like this." "Nor did I," he admitted, turning his head to press a kiss to her palm. "But I thank God every day that I was there, that I found you." They remained in the study for another hour, talking softly, exchanging kisses and making plans. When Eleanor finally returned to her room, she felt as though she was floating, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The next morning, Eleanor rose early, eager to share the news with her sisters. She found them already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast together. "You look different," Judith observed as soon as Eleanor entered. "Something's happened." Eleanor couldn't contain her smile. "Luke and I talked last night. He told me he loves me." Her sisters exchanged triumphant glances. "Finally," Josephine exclaimed. "We were wondering how long it would take him to say it." "You knew?" Eleanor asked, surprised. "Everyone knew," Julia said, giggling. "Except maybe you two." "The way he looks at you when you're not watching," Judith explained. "And the way you light up whenever he enters a room. It was only a matter of time." Eleanor shook her head, amazed at their perception. "He wants to speak with all of you this morning, to make his intentions clear." "His intentions?" Josephine raised an eyebrow suggestively. "To court me properly," Eleanor clarified, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. Julia clapped her hands in delight. How romantic, our sister, being courted by the most eligible bachelor in the county. As if summoned by their conversation, Luke appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hair still damp from washing, dressed in a clean shirt and his better trousers. He looked almost nervous, Eleanor realized with surprise. "Good morning, ladies," he greeted them, his eyes lingering on Eleanor with such obvious affection that her sisters exchanged knowing smiles. "Good morning, Luke," they chorused, watching with undisguised interest as he moved to Eleanor's side. "I take it Eleanor has shared our conversation from last night," he said. Judith nodded. "She has, and we couldn't be happier for both of you. But," Josephine added, her expression turning serious, "if you hurt our sister, remember that we know where you sleep." "Josephine." Eleanor gasped, mortified. Luke, however, laughed. "A fair warning," he acknowledged. "Though I have no intention of ever giving you cause for concern, I love your sister and I intend to spend my life making her happy if she'll let me." The sincerity in his voice silenced even Josephine's teasing. Julia, always the most emotional of the sisters, wiped a tear from her eye. "What does this mean for us?" Judith asked practically. "For all of us, I mean." Luke addressed them all, his voice steady and sure. "The Double J is your home for as long as you want it to be. Nothing about that has changed. I meant what I said yesterday. There's room here for all of you to build the lives you want. My feelings for Eleanor don't alter that promise." The relief on her sisters' faces made Eleanor realize how worried they had been, despite their teasing. For so long, they had depended on her as their protector and provider. Now, with her attention shifting to include Luke, they had feared being left behind. "We're still a family," she assured them, reaching out to take Luke's hand. "That won't ever change. It's just expanding a little." The breakfast that followed was filled with laughter and plans. Luke spoke of improvements to the ranch that would allow each sister to pursue her interests, an expanded garden for Josephine, better accounting systems for Judith to manage, art supplies for Julia. His generosity and thoughtfulness touched Eleanor deeply, confirming what she already knew, that her heart had chosen wisely. As summer turned to autumn, Eleanor and Luke's courtship progressed with the blessing of her sisters and the bemused observation of the townspeople. True to his word, Luke treated her with the utmost respect, escorting her to church on Sundays, taking her for rides around the ranch property, and spending evenings by the fire discussing books and sharing stories of their lives before they met. Their growing relationship did not go unnoticed in Willow Creek. Most people seemed genuinely pleased to see the solitary rancher finding happiness, though Victoria Thornton made her disapproval clear with cutting remarks whenever they encountered her in town. "Quite a charming arrangement you've made for yourself," she commented acidly to Eleanor after church one Sunday. "4 women living under your roof, Luke. The town is positively buzzing with speculation." "The town can speculate all it wants," Luke replied coolly. "The Ambrose sisters are respected members of my household, and Eleanor is the woman I intend to marry. If anyone has a problem with that, they're welcome to discuss it with me directly." Victoria's face had paled at the word marry, and she withdrew without further comment. As they walked back to the wagon, Eleanor squeezed Luke's hand. "Did you mean that?" she asked. "About marriage," he stopped, turning to face her in the middle of the street, heedless of the curious glances from church-goers. "I've meant it since the night I told you I loved you," he said. "I was waiting for the right moment to ask properly." Eleanor's heart raced. "And when might that moment be?" A slow smile spread across his face. "I thought maybe when we get back to the ranch, unless you'd prefer I get down on one knee right here in the middle of Main Street." She laughed, joy bubbling up inside her. The ranch would be perfect. True to his word, that afternoon, after they had returned home and changed from their church clothes, Luke asked Eleanor to walk with him to the pond where they had shared their first real conversation months before. As they stood beside the water, golden leaves drifting down from the trees around them, he took both her hands in his. "Eleanor Ambrose," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "When I rode into Tropic that day, I had no idea how completely my life was about to change. I thought I was rescuing 4 young women from a terrible situation, but the truth is, you rescued me too from loneliness, from a life half-lived." He lowered himself to one knee, still holding her hands, and pulled a small box from his pocket. "I love you more than I ever thought possible. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Opening the box, he revealed a delicate gold ring with a single diamond that caught the autumn sunlight, sending prisms of color dancing across their joined hands. Tears of happiness filled Eleanor's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, Luke Jackson, I will marry you." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood to pull her into his arms. Their kiss was tender and full of promise, sealing the commitment they had just made to each other. "It was my mother's," Luke said softly when they broke apart, nodding at the ring. "I've kept it all these years, waiting for the right person to give it to." Eleanor looked down at the ring, touched by the significance of the gesture. "It's beautiful. I'll treasure it always." Hand in hand, they walked back to the house to share their news with her sisters. The celebration that ensued lasted well into the evening, with Luke opening a bottle of fine whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion, toasting to their future together. As winter approached, wedding preparations began in earnest. They decided on a Christmas ceremony, allowing enough time for preparations but not so long that they had to endure an extended engagement. The sisters threw themselves into the planning with enthusiasm, transforming the Double J into a festive venue worthy of the occasion. Eleanor found herself busier than she had ever been, dividing her time between normal ranch duties and wedding preparations. Luke, seeing her exhaustion one evening, insisted she take a break. "The wedding will happen whether you work yourself to the bone or not," he pointed out, guiding her to a chair by the fire and handing her a cup of hot cider. "I prefer my bride healthy and rested when the day comes." She smiled up at him gratefully. "It's just that I want everything to be perfect." "It will be," he assured her, taking the seat beside her. "Because at the end of the day, you'll be my wife and I'll be your husband. Everything else is just details." His simple perspective helped center her, reminding her of what truly mattered amid the whirlwind of preparations. As December arrived, bringing with it a light dusting of snow that transformed the ranch into a winter wonderland, final arrangements fell into place. Judith had taken charge of the guest list. Josephine was overseeing the food preparation with help from women in town, and Julia had created beautiful decorations using evergreen boughs, red berries, and candles. A week before the wedding, Eleanor received a surprise visitor at the ranch. Mrs. Peterson from the restaurant in Willow Creek arrived with a large package. "For the bride," she announced, presenting it to Eleanor with a warm smile. "From the ladies of Willow Creek." Inside, Eleanor found a beautiful wedding dress of ivory satin and lace, along with a note signed by several women from town. "For the woman who brought Luke Jackson back to the land of the living. May your marriage be blessed with joy, love, and many children. Welcome to our community, Eleanor." Touched beyond words, Eleanor could only stare at the exquisite gown. Mrs. Peterson patted her hand. "Luke's been alone too long," she said simply. "We're all glad he found you." The wedding day dawned clear and cold, the Double J Ranch transformed into a Christmas wonderland. Luke had spent the previous night in town at the hotel, honoring tradition that the groom shouldn't see his bride before the ceremony. Eleanor stood in her bedroom, her sisters helping her into the beautiful gown from the townswomen. As Judith arranged her hair, weaving small white flowers into the golden strands, Julia brushed away a tear. "Mother would be so proud," she said softly. Eleanor swallowed past the lump in her throat. "I hope so. I wish she could be here." "She is, in a way," Judith said, placing a hand over Eleanor's heart. "Right here. And Father too, though he would probably be terrified of Luke." They laughed, the moment of sadness passing as they completed Eleanor's preparations. When they were finished, she stood before the mirror, hardly recognizing the elegant woman who gazed back at her. The ivory dress complemented her fair complexion, and the flowers in her hair gave her the appearance of a winter bride from a fairy tale. "You're beautiful," Josephine declared, uncharacteristically emotional. A knock at the door announced that it was time. Jeb Taylor, who had offered to escort Eleanor in place of her father, waited in the hallway, dressed in a suit that looked as though it had been stored in a trunk for decades. "Miss Eleanor," he said, his weathered face creasing in a wide smile. "Don't you look like an angel from heaven?" The ceremony was held in the main room of the ranch house, which had been cleared of furniture and decorated with evergreens, holly berries, and countless candles. Guests from Willow Creek and neighboring ranches filled the space, turning to watch as Eleanor entered on Jeb's arm. But Eleanor saw only Luke, standing tall and handsome at the far end of the room, his eyes fixed on her with an expression of such love and wonder that it took her breath away. He wore a new suit, his dark hair neatly combed, but it was the joy in his face that transformed him from the solemn rancher she had first met into the man who had captured her heart. The minister's words washed over her as she took her place beside Luke, their hands joining as they exchanged vows. When he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger to join her engagement ring, his hands were steady and sure, just like the words he spoke pledging his life to hers. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared at last. "You may kiss your bride." Luke's kiss was tender yet passionate, a promise of the life they would build together. Around them, the guests erupted in applause, but Eleanor heard only the beating of her own heart and Luke's whispered words as they broke apart. "I love you, Mrs. Jackson." The celebration that followed was joyous, with food and drink flowing freely, music from a small band of local musicians, and dancing that lasted well into the night. Eleanor found herself passed from partner to partner, as tradition dictated, but her eyes always sought out Luke, finding him watching her with an expression that made her long for the moment when they could finally be alone. That moment came late in the evening, after many of the guests had departed and only close friends remained. Luke appeared at her side, taking her hand and leading her discreetly toward the stairs. "I think we can slip away now," he murmured against her ear. "Jeb will see to the remaining guests." Eleanor glanced back at her sisters, who gave her encouraging smiles and shooing gestures. With a mixture of nervousness and anticipation, she allowed Luke to guide her upstairs to the master bedroom that would now be theirs. Inside, the room had been transformed. Fresh linens adorned the large bed, candles cast a soft glow across the polished furniture, and a small fire crackled in the fireplace, warding off the December chill. "Your sisters," Luke explained, seeing her surprise. "They arranged it while we were dancing." Eleanor made a mental note to thank them in the morning. For now, though, she had eyes only for her new husband, who stood watching her with a mixture of desire and tenderness that made her heart race. Slowly, reverently, he crossed to her, his fingers gently touching her cheek. "I can hardly believe you're really my wife," he said softly. "Believe it," she whispered, lifting her face to his. "I'm yours, Luke Jackson, now and always." His kiss was different from those they had shared before, deeper, more urgent, yet still restrained by his respect for her. Eleanor responded with a passion that surprised them both, her hands reaching up to tangle in his hair as she pressed herself closer to him. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Luke's eyes had darkened with desire. "I've waited so long to hold you like this," he admitted. "You don't have to wait any longer," she assured him, her heart pounding with anticipation and love. Their first night as husband and wife was everything Eleanor had dreamed and more tender, passionate, and filled with discoveries about each other that could only be made in the intimacy they now shared. Afterward, lying in Luke's arms as the fire burned low, Eleanor felt a contentment that went bone deep, a certainty that she had found her place in the world. "What are you thinking about?" Luke asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. She smiled up at him. "About how far we've come. From that auction block in Tropic to this moment, it seems almost unbelievable." "Not to me," he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "From the moment I saw you standing there, so brave despite everything, I knew there was something special about you. I just didn't realize then how completely you would change my life." "You changed mine too," she reminded him. "You saved us." He shook his head slightly. "We saved each other, Eleanor. That's what love does at its best. It rescues both people, not just one." As she drifted to sleep in the arms of her husband, Eleanor knew he was right. What had begun as a rescue had become a true partnership, a joining of souls that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Christmas morning dawned bright and clear, sunlight streaming through the bedroom windows and casting golden patterns across the rumpled sheets. Eleanor woke to find Luke watching her, his expression one of wonder and contentment. "Merry Christmas, wife," he murmured, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Merry Christmas, husband," she replied, the words still new and magical on her tongue. They dressed and descended to the main floor, where they found her sisters already up, sipping coffee and exchanging their own Christmas gifts. Warm greetings and teasing remarks about the newlyweds' late appearance followed, but there was genuine happiness in everyone's faces as they gathered for a festive breakfast. Afterward, Luke surprised them all by producing gifts from beneath the Christmas tree that Julia had insisted on setting up in the corner of the main room. For Judith, there was a fine leather-bound ledger and a set of quality pens for her work with the ranch accounts. Josephine received books on advanced gardening techniques and seeds for rare vegetable varieties. Julia's gift was an elaborate set of art supplies, paints, brushes, and high-quality paper that made her eyes widen with delight. For Eleanor, there was a small package wrapped in silver paper. Inside, she found a delicate gold locket. When she opened it, she discovered a tiny portrait of her mother that Luke had somehow obtained and had miniaturized by an artist in Denver. "How did you?" she began, tears welling in her eyes. "Judith had a photograph," he explained. "I wanted you to have a way to keep your mother close to your heart, today of all days." The thoughtfulness of the gift overwhelmed her. Eleanor threw her arms around her husband, burying her face in his shoulder as tears of gratitude flowed freely. "Thank you," she whispered. "It's perfect." The sisters had pooled their resources to give Luke a fine new saddle, handcrafted by the best leatherworker in Willow Creek. His genuine appreciation confirmed what they already knew, that he valued their thoughtfulness far more than the cost of any gift. As the day progressed, neighbors stopped by with more wedding gifts and to share Christmas cheer. The house rang with laughter and conversation, the joyous atmosphere a stark contrast to the uncertainty and fear that had marked the Ambrose sisters' lives just 6 months earlier. In a quiet moment, as Luke and Eleanor stood together on the porch watching the sunset paint the snow-covered landscape in hues of pink and gold, he wrapped his arm around her waist and pulled her close against the December chill. "Happy?" he asked simply. Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, contentment flowing through her. "More than I ever thought possible," she assured him. "Are you?" His answer was to turn her gently in his arms, cradling her face between his hands as he kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart swell. "Eleanor Jackson," he said when they parted, "you've made me the happiest man in the territory, maybe in the whole country," she laughed, joy bubbling up inside her. "That's quite a claim, Mr. Jackson." "I stand by it," he declared, his eyes twinkling. "And I intend to spend the rest of my life proving it to you." As they returned inside to join her sisters around the fire, Eleanor reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. From the desperation of the auction block to the warm security of the Double J Ranch, from fear to love, from uncertainty to promise, it had been a transformation none of them could have imagined. That night, as she lay in Luke's arms once more, Eleanor whispered a prayer of gratitude for the man who had seen 4 desperate young women and said those life-changing words, "I'll take all 4 home." Little had he known then that in saving them, he was finding his own path to happiness, creating not just a household but a family that would flourish in the years to come. The years that followed brought changes and growth to the Double J Ranch. With Luke's encouragement, Judith began managing not just the ranch's accounts, but those of several neighboring properties as well, earning respect throughout the county for her financial acumen. Josephine's expanded garden became renowned, supplying vegetables to Willow Creek, and eventually leading her to open a small shop in town selling preserved foods and gardening supplies. Julia's artistic talents flourished under Luke's patronage. Her paintings of ranch life and the stunning Utah landscapes began selling to travelers, and eventually caught the attention of a gallery owner from Salt Lake City, who commissioned works from her regularly. As for Eleanor, she found her dream of teaching realized in an unexpected way. When the schoolteacher in Willow Creek departed to get married, the town council approached her about taking over the position. With Luke's full support, she accepted, dividing her time between the ranch and the schoolhouse in town, finding deep satisfaction in shaping young minds. In their second year of marriage, Eleanor discovered she was expecting their first child. Luke's reaction to the news dropping to his knees before her, his head resting against her still flat stomach, tears in his eyes as he whispered words of love and gratitude, would remain one of her most cherished memories. Their son, William James Jackson, was born on a crisp autumn day, his lusty cries announcing his arrival to the world. Luke, who had paced anxiously outside the bedroom during Eleanor's labor, entered with trepidation when the midwife finally invited him in, only to be transformed at the sight of his wife holding their child. "He's perfect," Luke whispered, carefully taking the swaddled infant in his arms, his expression a mixture of awe and terror at the tiny life he now held. "He looks like you," Eleanor observed tiredly, proud of the dark hair already visible on their son's head. Luke shook his head, his finger gently stroking the baby's cheek. "He has your nose, and hopefully your disposition. The world doesn't need another stubborn Jackson man." Eleanor laughed, exhaustion forgotten in the joy of the moment. "I think one stubborn Jackson man is exactly what the world needed," she countered. "At least, it's what I needed." 2 years later, their family expanded again with the birth of twin daughters, Sarah and Rebecca, who arrived in the middle of a spring thunderstorm that Luke insisted was nature's way of celebrating their arrival. The girls, with their mother's blonde hair and their father's green eyes, became the darlings of the ranch, doted on not just by their parents but by their aunts as well. As the children grew, so did the Double J. Under Luke's careful management, and with the help of the Ambrose sisters, the ranch prospered beyond his original expectations. New buildings were added, the herd expanded, and the Double J's reputation for quality cattle spread throughout the territory. With their growing success came increased standing in the community. Luke, once viewed as a reclusive figure, became a respected leader in county affairs, his opinion sought on matters ranging from water rights to road improvements. Eleanor's position as teacher gave her influence in educational matters, and together, they worked to improve conditions for all residents of Willow Creek. Even Victoria Thornton eventually thawed toward them, particularly after Eleanor organized a successful fundraiser for the town's new library, a project Mrs. Thornton had championed for years without success. The grudging respect that developed between the two women never quite blossomed into friendship, but the open hostility faded into civil acknowledgement. As for the Ambrose sisters, their lives took different paths, but remained interwoven with the Double J. Judith was the first to marry, accepting the proposal of a widowed banker from Willow Creek, who appreciated both her intelligence and her loving relationship with his young son. Josephine found love with a botanist who came west to study desert plants, and stayed after meeting the spirited gardener from the Double J. Julia, the youngest, took longest to settle down, traveling to Denver and Salt Lake City for her art, before returning to marry her childhood sweetheart, the son of one of the ranchers who had helped repair the fence line after that long-ago storm. Through it all, the Double J remained the center of their extended family, the place where they gathered for holidays and celebrations, where children played and grew, where the love that had begun in the most unlikely circumstances continued to flourish and deepen. 10 years after their wedding, on a warm summer evening much like the one when they had first confessed their feelings, Luke and Eleanor sat together on the porch of their ranch house, watching their children play in the yard with their cousins. The sound of childish laughter filled the air as William, now 8, led his younger sisters and their cousins in an elaborate game of make-believe. "Did you ever imagine this?" Eleanor asked, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "That day in Tropic, did you ever think we'd end up here?" Luke's arm tightened around her waist, his lips brushing her temple. "Not in my wildest dreams," he admitted. "I hope to give you and your sisters safety, a chance at decent lives. I never expected all of this, a family, children, the kind of happiness I didn't even know to wish for." "You changed our fate that day," she said softly. "With 5 words, 'I'll take all 4 home,'" he smiled, remembering. "Best decision I ever made. Even better than asking me to marry you," she teased. "That was inevitable from the moment I saw you," he replied, his voice warm with the love that had only deepened through the years. "Even if I was too stubborn to recognize it right away." Eleanor turned in his embrace, looking up into the face that had become as familiar to her as her own, yet still had the power to make her heart race. The laugh lines around his eyes had deepened, and streaks of silver now threaded through his dark hair, but the love in his gaze remained unchanged, steady, sure, and boundless. "I love you, Luke Jackson," she said simply. "Every day more than the day before." "And I love you, Eleanor Jackson," he replied, lowering his head to claim her lips in a kiss that held all the passion of their youth and all the depth that comes with years shared in joy and sorrow, in work and rest, in the building of a life together. As the sun set over the Double J Ranch, painting the sky in glorious hues of gold and crimson, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought them to this place. From 4 frightened young women on an auction block to a prosperous, happy family deeply rooted in the community. It was a transformation that still seemed miraculous. Yet perhaps the greatest miracle of all was the love that had grown between her and the quiet rancher who had taken a stand that day in Tropic, who had looked at 4 desperate sisters and seen not commodities to be purchased, but human beings worthy of respect and care. In saving them, he had found his own salvation, and together, they had built something beautiful and enduring in this corner of the Wild West. As darkness fell and they called the children inside, Luke took Eleanor's hand, raising it to his lips in a gesture that still had the power to make her pulse quicken even after a decade of marriage. Their eyes met in the gathering dusk, a lifetime of shared memories and promises kept reflected in that glance. "Come on, Mrs. Jackson," he said softly. "Let's go home." And with her hand in his, surrounded by the family they had created together, Eleanor followed her husband into the warmth and light of the house that had become so much more than just a shelter. It had become the home her heart had always sought.